They had built the whole afternoon around the certainty that we could not see. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing I have left from those years, and because the certainty was not arrogance in the way you would expect from a body that ruled a third of the settled galaxy. It was quieter than arrogance. It was the calm of an institution that had checked its own answer so many times that the checking had become a kind of prayer. The Concord Assembly did not hate us. It had simply decided, decades before I was born, that Earth was a blind world, and it had never once been given a reason to doubt the finding. That was the work of 40 years. That was our work. And on the day they finally moved to make the lie official, I was the one carrying the proof that the lie had always been ours. I had been seated in the second row of the human delegation since before the Concord even opened the chamber. They make you wait. It is part of the architecture of the place, not cruelty, but choreography. The assembly hall of the Concord sits under a single span of glass 300 meters across, a dome of joined panels the color of pale water, and the morning light came down through it in long, unhurried shafts that moved across the floor as the hours passed. The floor was marble, real stone hauled from some founding world, veined gray and white and polished until it threw back a soft ghost of everything above it. Around and below the central well rose the tiers, curved benches climbing in rings, filling slowly with the delegates of the member species, until the whole bowl of the chamber was packed with bodies that were not human and did not pretend to be. The Veshtai held the high benches as they always did. They are tall when they stand, taller than any of us, with long gray-mottled limbs and elongated skulls that taper back into a ridge of pale bone, and their eyes are large and dark and set wide, the eyes of a species that evolved in low light and never quite forgave the universe for it. They wore the layered ceremonial robes of the assembly, silk fine and embroidered along the hems with the script of the founding charter, and they sat with the stillness of people who have never in living memory been contradicted. Below them in the lower rings came the others, the Sethric with their 4 scholarly arms folded in their laps, the pale luminous chamber elders of the Aun whose skin glowed faintly under the cool interior light, the squat armored delegates of half a dozen client worlds who had been clients so long they had forgotten the word meant anything. Hundreds of them. A mass. And down in the well, at the long curved table set into the floor of the chamber, the 7 of us. Ambassador Tomas Wren sat at the center of our table. He was old by then, past 70, with the kind of face that had stopped performing anything a long time ago, heavy-lidded, deeply lined, the skin gone slack at the jaw, hands folded in front of him on the cool stone. He had been a soldier once, a very long time ago, and then a negotiator, and then for the last 15 years he had been the single human being the Concord trusted to be predictably weak. That was his great talent. He had spent a decade and a half teaching them, gently, patiently, that Earth was a frightened and limited little world that wanted only to be left alone. He was very good at it. He was the best of us at it. And the Concord loved him for it, in the way you love a small animal that has learned not to bite. I was 3 seats and 1 row behind him, which in the protocol of that chamber meant I was furniture. My title, on the Concord's own manifest, was Recording Liaison, Human Delegation, a clerk who managed the documents and the data slate and the dull machinery of a meeting. That is what they thought I was. The slate in front of me held the entire reason we had come. The presiding officer that day was First Speaker Seilvor of the Veshtai, and when the chamber was finally full she rose from the high bench, and the light caught the bone ridge of her skull, and the great hall went still. She did not raise her voice. She never did. The acoustics of the dome carried even a whisper to the topmost ring, and she spoke into that silence the way a person speaks into a room where they own everything. The assembly recognizes the delegation of Earth, she said, and thanks them for their patience. Wren inclined his head. He did not stand. The protocol did not require him to, and he had a way of using the letter of the protocol like a tool, knowing exactly how much courtesy to spend and never a coin more. The assembly convenes, the first speaker continued. to ratify the stewardship accord between the Concord of Worlds and the human settlements of the Sol system and its dependent colonies. The accord has been prepared in accordance with the findings of the survey, reviewed by the Bench of Determinations, and entered into the permanent record. It remains only to be affirmed. She let that sit, affirmed, not negotiated, not debated, affirmed, the word a body uses when it believes the outcome was settled before anyone walked in, and the truth is that she was right to believe it by every measure she had. The Stewardship Accord was a beautiful piece of work. I had read it 40 times. It was generous in its phrasing and total in its effect. It placed every human world, every shipyard, every orbital, every survey station under the administration of a Concord Stewardship Office, in exchange for protection, for trade access, for a seat, a non-voting seat in the lower rings of the very chamber we were sitting in. It was not conquest. The Concord did not do conquest anymore. That was for the old empires, the crude ones, the ones the Concord had absorbed and improved upon. It was stewardship. It was the considerate management of a species that could not manage itself. And it rested, every clause of it, on a single finding. I knew the finding by heart. Survey Determination 9114, ratified by the Bench of Determinations in the 41st year before that morning, that the human species was a low-perception people, possessed of crude sensor capability, blind beyond the immediate volume of its home star, incapable of monitoring events in conquered space, and therefore, this was the operative word, therefore unable to be a meaningful participant in galactic affairs except as a ward. Blind. The whole edifice stood on the word blind. It was the most expensive lie my species ever told, and it had not cost us a single thing we were not glad to spend. A Sethric scribe in the lower ring began to read the accord aloud, clause by clause, in the flat ceremonial cadence of the chamber. It would take an hour. The Concord likes its rituals long. The length is the point, the slow grinding weight of process meant to make the outcome feel inevitable by the time you reach the signature line. I watched the light move across the marble. I watched the Veshtai on the high benches, serene, certain, occasionally murmuring among themselves with the relaxed boredom of people attending a formality. I watched Ren, who sat through the reading the way he sat through everything, perfectly still, his eyes half closed, looking for all the world like an old man trying not to fall asleep. He was not asleep. I had worked beside him for 11 years and I had learned to read the small economy of his stillness. He was listening to every word. He was waiting. When the scribe finished, the first speaker rose again. "The reading is complete," she said. "Does the delegation of Earth wish to speak before affirmation?" This was the moment they expected the plea. I had seen the records of other ratifications, other client worlds folded into the Concord's gentle administration over the centuries, and there was always a speech here. The ward-to-be would rise and thank the assembly for its mercy, and ask for some small concession, some softening of a clause, and the Concord would grant a little and withhold a little, and everyone would understand that the asking and the granting were themselves part of the ceremony, the last formal acknowledgement that one party had power and the other did not. They had drafted, somewhere in the stewardship office, an estimate of what Earth would ask for. I had seen that estimate too. We see a great deal. Ren opened his eyes. He looked up at the first speaker on her high bench and across the rings of delegates, and he let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he spoke, and his voice was quiet and dry and entirely without heat. "One question," he said, "for the record." The first speaker tilted her head, the Veshtai gesture of permission. "The delegation may ask." "The accord rests on Survey Determination 9114, Ren said. "The finding that Earth is a blind world. I would like the Assembly to confirm, for the permanent record, that this finding still stands. That the Concord affirms today that humanity cannot see into conquered space." There was a small stir among the Veshtai, not alarm, nothing like alarm, only the faint surprise of people asked to confirm that water is wet. The first speaker glanced toward the bench of determinations, where the gray-robed officials of the survey sat, and one of them, an ancient Veshtai with a skull gone nearly white, rose and answered in the cracked formal voice of his office. "The finding stands," he said. "Determination 9114 is the settled position of the Concord, reviewed in each decade of its existence and never amended. The human species is sensor-limited and perception-blind beyond its home volume. This is not in dispute." "Thank you," Wren said. "I wanted it on the record." And he folded his hands again and said nothing more. I think that was the first moment any of them felt it. Not understood it, understanding came later, and it came hard but felt it, the way you feel a draft in a sealed room and cannot say where it comes from. A blind client race does not ask the council to confirm its blindness on the record. A frightened ward does not request, with cold courtesy, that its masters formally restate the foundation of their own authority. There is no reason to ask such a thing unless you intend to do something with the answer. Several of the Veshtai on the high bench exchanged glances. The first speaker did not. She had spent too long being right to be unsettled by an old man's strange question, and she moved the proceeding forward with the smooth authority of her office. "Then the assembly will proceed to affirmation," she said. "The delegation of Earth will present its instrument of accession." This was my cue, and I had been waiting for it for 11 years. The instrument of accession was, in the normal course of these things, a single document, the formal signature of the acceding world, transmitted to the chamber's central display, so the whole assembly could witness the moment a free people became a ward. The display was a wide curved field of cyan light that hung above the central well, fed from the delegation's table, and the protocol was that the recording liaison, me, would load the instrument and the assembly would watch it resolve. They had built that system, that beautiful open conduit from our table straight to the eyes of every delegate in the chamber, on the assumption that nothing we could put through it would ever be anything but what they expected. I rose. I felt the eyes come to me in curious eyes, the eyes you give to the clerk who works the machinery, and I confess that after 11 years of being looked at that way, I felt something I am not proud of, a small private heat, and I made myself put it down. Wren had taught me that too. The work does not care how you feel about it. I crossed to the table's interface and I keyed in the instrument, and the cyan field above the well brightened and began to resolve. It was not a signature. The first thing that came up was a date 41 years old, the very year of survey determination 9114, and beneath it, a single line of Concord fleet traffic, an encrypted movement order issued by the Veshtai Border Command, decrypted in full, the cipher key annotated in the margin. It was the order that had moved the Concord's 3rd Reserve Fleet to the marches of human space in the year they had decided we could not see. It was, in its small way, the founding document of 40 years of patient hostility, the moment the Concord had quietly begun to surround a world it had filed as blind. And it was on the chamber display, in their own script, in front of the entire assembly. The hall did not erupt. I want to be honest about that because the records that came later, the ones the survivors told, always make it sound like an explosion. It was the opposite of an explosion. It was a silence that deepened. The murmur of the high benches stopped. The Sethric in the lower rings went still. Even the light through the dome seemed to hold. The first speaker's voice came down, and for the first time there was something in it that had not been there before. "That is not an instrument of accession." "No," Wren said, "it is not." I keyed the next page. The second thing on the display was a private deliberation of the bench of determinations, recorded in the Veshtai's own chambers 19 years before. A debate among the survey officials about whether the finding of human blindness could be safely maintained given certain anomalies in the border sensor record, anomalies that suggested someone was reading Concord signals. The transcript showed them deciding after long discussion that the anomalies were equipment faults, that no blind species could possibly be the cause, that the finding would stand. It showed them choosing, deliberately, to believe their own determination over the evidence in front of them. And it showed the name of the official who had argued, alone and unheeded, that they should look closer. He was dead now. He had been right. I let that one sit on the display a long moment. Then I keyed the next. Page after page. I had built this sequence over 2 years, and Wren and I had argued every entry, what to include and what to hold, because the power of the thing was not in its volume but in its order, the slow, remorseless climb from one undeniable document to the next. Fleet dispositions, supply manifests, the construction logs of the forward bases the Concord had built in the dark systems along our frontier, bases they were certain we had never charted. Diplomatic cables between the stewardship office and the high benches discussing, in plain language, the timing of the accord, how long to wait, how thoroughly to let Earth's economy grow dependent on Concord trade before the offer of stewardship was made, how to ensure the ward would be too entangled to refuse. The architecture of 40 years of management, all of it, every secret beam, read and recorded and decrypted by the blind world they had built it to manage. And here is the thing I most want you to understand, the thing that took the chamber longest to grasp. We had not stolen these signals in some recent burst of cleverness, some desperate eve-of-the-meeting raid. The dates told the story. The earliest entries were 41 years old. The most recent were from the week before. We had been reading the Concord continuously, completely, for the entire span of their certainty that we were blind. We had watched them decide we could not see. We had watched them act on it. We had watched them build the trap, year by year, and we had said nothing. And we had let our own ambassadors play the frightened ward in this very chamber. And we had taken the lie they handed us about ourselves, and we had wrapped ourselves in it, and used it as cover for the longest and quietest intelligence operation in the history of our species. They had filed us as blind. We had let them, because a body that believes you cannot see will perform all of its secrets in front of you. A delegate of the Aun, far up in the luminous ring, stood without permission, a breach of protocol so severe that in any other session it would have been the only thing anyone spoke of for days. No one moved to stop her. Her pale skin had gone dim. "How long?" she said, and her translated voice came thin through the chamber. "How long have you been inside our signals?" Wren did not answer her. He answered the chamber. He answered all of them at once, and he did it in the way that I have spent the rest of my life trying to describe to people who were not there, because it was the most human thing I have ever seen a man do, and there was nothing in it that raised a voice. "You asked us a few minutes ago to confirm the finding," he said. "You did confirm it. It's on the record now in your own words that humanity is blind. I wanted that there before any of this so that when the historians of the Concord read the minutes of this session, and they will, they understand the exact shape of what happened here. You told yourselves a story about us. We did not correct it. A people who decide you cannot see will let you watch everything." He paused. The whole bowl of the chamber leaned into the silence. We saw all of it. That was the sentence. I have heard it repeated in 100 forms since, embroidered and dramatized and put into the mouths of figures who were nowhere near that hall, but the real sentence was 4 words long, and Wren said it the way you would tell someone the time. We saw all of it. He did not stand to say it. He did not strike the table. There was no thunder in him. He was an old man stating a fact that had been true for 40 years, and the fact landed on that chamber with a weight that no shout could ever have carried. And then the first speaker, and I will give her this, she was no fool. She was the sharpest mind in that body, and she understood faster than anyone what the display in front of her meant. The first speaker looked up, not at us, through the dome. I have thought a great deal in the years since about why she looked up at that moment, and I believe it was instinct, the oldest instinct of any creature that has just learned it misjudged a threat. She looked for the threat. She looked at the sky. The dome of the assembly hall shows the sky above the Concord seat world in real time, 300 meters of joined glass open to a pale blue heaven, and through it, on a clear morning, You can see the orbital traffic of the capital, the slow constellation of ships that any great power keeps over its throne. That morning the sky had been ordinary when we arrived. It was not ordinary now. They hung in the high blue like a decision that had already been made. Human ships, not the modest survey craft and trade haulers the Concord had catalogued as the limit of Earth's reach, but the other fleet, the one that did not appear in any Concord registry because we had never once let a Concord sensor see it, because for 40 years we had moved it in the gaps we knew the Concord was not watching. In the dark lanes, we knew their sentries swept on a schedule we had read decades ago. They were kilometers long, gray and unlovely, and built for one purpose, and there were enough of them over the Concord's own capital that even at that altitude, even through the glass, the chamber could count them. They had arrived during the reading of the accord. We had timed it to the clause. They had not fired. They did not need to fire. The arriving was the entire statement, and the statement was the same as Wren's. We saw all of it, including the way to your throne, and we have been able to do this for a long time, and you never knew. The chamber understood then all at once the full architecture of what it had done to itself. Determination 9114 was not merely wrong. It was the load-bearing wall of everything the Concord had built around us, and we had spent 40 years making sure they would never repair it. Every fleet movement they had hidden in front of us. Every deliberation they had sealed, we had read. The Stewardship Accord, the beautiful, generous total document that would have made wards of us, had been drafted by people who believed they were operating in the dark to a blind audience, and the blind audience had taken minutes. There was no clause they could revise, no concession they could offer, because the problem was not in the accord. The problem was that the Concord's entire relationship with humanity, from the founding determination forward, had been a performance staged for spectators its authors had been certain were not in the room. A Veshtai of the bench of determinations, the white-skulled official who had risen to confirm the finding, sat down very slowly, as though his own weight had become difficult to manage. I watched him do it. He had spent his life as a guardian of the finding. He had reviewed it each decade and let it stand. He was, I think, the first being in that chamber to grasp not just that he had been wrong, but how completely, how the wrongness reached backward through his entire career, and forward through every act the Concord had taken on the strength of his work. And I have never forgotten the way his great dark eyes moved from the display to the sky and back to the display, looking for some place to put a mistake of that size and finding none. The first speaker, to her enormous credit, did not look for one. She looked back down from the sky, and she looked at Wren, and when she spoke her voice had found a new register, lower and slower, the voice of someone setting down a thing they had carried so long they had forgotten its weight. "What do you want?" she said. It was not a negotiation. It was not even a question, really. It was a surrender phrased as a question, and everyone in the hall knew it. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nothing that is in the accord." He let her have that. He let the whole chamber have it, the understanding that everything they had prepared, every clause and concession and carefully drafted mercy, was now simply paper, because all of it had been built to manage a problem that did not exist. There was no blind world to steward. There never had been. There was only a people who had been willing to be thought blind for 40 years because the patience was worth more than the pride, and who had chosen this room, this ceremony, this exact clause of this exact reading to set the truth on the table, not to threaten, not to conquer, but to end, finally and on the permanent record, the single false sentence on which their whole subordination had rested. "Strike the finding," Wren said. "Determination 9114. Strike it from the record in this session with the Assembly as witness. Not amend it, strike it. And then we will talk as what we are, not as what you decided we were." He paused. "That is the only instrument I have come to present." The first speaker held his gaze for a long moment. 300 meters above her, the gray ships held their station in the pale sky, patient, unfiring, undeniable. Around her, in the rings, a third of the settled galaxy sat in a silence that I do not think that chamber had known in its entire history. The silence of a body that has just discovered that the floor it stood on was a story it told itself, and that the people in the well had been holding the real floor in their hands the entire time, and had simply been waiting, with a patience that frightened them now more than any fleet, for the most useful moment to set it down. She struck the finding. She did it herself with her own authority before the bench could be consulted, because she understood that consultation was no longer a thing the Concord could afford to perform in front of us. The Scion display cleared the accord and showed, in the founding script of the Charter, the formal annulment of Survey Determination 9114, and the white-skulled official watched the work of his life dissolve into light, and somewhere in the upper rings, a delegate made a low sound that the translators did not render and did not need to. We did not gloat. I want that understood because it is the part the dramatized versions always get wrong, the part where they have us crowing in the well. We did not. Ren rose at last, and the rising was its own kind of statement, that the old man who had spent 15 years teaching them, he was harmless, had been standing the whole time on something they could not see. And he gathered nothing, because there was nothing to gather, and he simply waited while I cleared the display and shut down the conduit they had so generously built from our table to their eyes. Then the 7 of us walked out of the well and up the long central aisle, and the rings of the Concord turned to watch us go. Hundreds of faces that were not human and did not pretend to be, and not one of them said a word, because there was nothing left to say that we had not already read. The light through the dome had moved while we sat. It fell now in a long, bright bar across the marble of the aisle, and we walked through it toward the great doors, and the gray ships hung silent in the pale sky above the glass, and I remember thinking, with the flat clarity that comes after a thing you have prepared for over years has finally happened, that we had not won anything that afternoon. Winning was the wrong word for it. We had simply stopped pretending, on a schedule of our own choosing, and the Concord had discovered that the pretending had been the only thing protecting it. I was the last of the delegation through the doors. I paused there at the threshold, and I looked back once at the first speaker on her high bench, at the white-skulled official with the ruin of his life on the display before him, at the whole great bowl of the chamber sitting in its new and total silence under the moving light. The first speaker was looking at me, not at Ren, who was already through the doors. At me, the clerk, the recording liaison, the piece of furniture who had worked the machinery, and who had loaded 40 years into a conduit they built for a signature. I think she understood in that look, the last and worst part of it, that the operation had never needed its great men. That it had been carried, year on patient year, by the unwatched people in the second row, the ones a body files as furniture, because a power that decides who matters will perform all of its secrets in front of the ones it has decided do not. I did not smile at her. There was nothing to smile about. We had spent 40 years being thought blind, and the cost of it, the ambassadors who had played frightened until they died of it, the analysts who had read a hostile galaxy in silence and never once been allowed to say so, the whole long discipline of being underestimated on purpose. That cost was not the kind you celebrate. It was the kind you carry. I held her gaze a moment, the way Ren had taught me. Then I turned and walked out into the bright morning, under the gray ships and the pale sky, and behind me the doors of the assembly hall of the Concord swung slowly shut on a silence they would be a very long time learning to fill. We were never blind. We only ever let them think so, because a people who are certain you cannot see will show you the whole of what they are. That is the oldest weapon there is, and the patient ones have always known it. And the loud ones have never once believed it could be true. Right up until the morning the quiet world in the second row sets 40 years on the table, and the great hall goes still, and the sky above the throne is full of ships that should not have been able to find it. They had a word for us, in their records for 40 years. After that morning, they had to find another. Istori ka tittle, do 100 character.